Did slavery build America? Is the reason that America is the most prosperous society in history economically due to slavery? What galvanized me into that question is the 1619 Project that has been created by the New York Times. It is a collection of essays with the hypothesis that America's economic power is due to slavery. Now, if this was just a collection of essays, I would promptly ignore it. But this way of thinking is being tested in some public schools, which in effect will end up being in the curriculum for the standards of the public schools. Since that is transpiring, let's ask the question. Let's look at it from a historical perspective. Let's dissect it. After that, then we will get into why this question is now being propagated. If slavery truly built America, why was it not able to provide the strength the South needed to be able to crush the North? And what did the North have that made it so great without the history of slavery? By 1840, many Southerners reasoned that by staking everything on agriculture, the region had wasted chances in manufacturing and trade. After the War of 1812, as cotton growing swept everything before it, the South became increasingly dependent on Northern manufacturing and trade. Cotton and tobacco were exported mainly in Northern vessels. Southerners also relied on connections in the North for imported goods. The South became economically dependent on the North. That isn't the description of strength that one would think would come from a region full of slaves, which America was supposedly built upon. Instead, it would appear that a region dependent upon enslaving others ended up enslaving itself to a free North. See, this is a real life, living and breathing hypothesis that we can test. If the foundation of the argument is that slavery is responsible for the wealth of the country, then why was the South dependent economically upon the North? And if it made the South so prosperous and powerful, why did they not win the war? But let's further dissect this. These are some statistics from the time. In 1860, the North had over 110,000 manufacturing establishments. The South had just 18,000. The North produced 94% of the country's iron, 97% of its coal, 97% of its firearms. The North contained 22,000 miles of railroads to the South's 8,500. And also, some of those railroads in the South were only designed for cotton transportation, for small products. In the North, they were designed for larger, more manufacturing products. The North outperformed the South agriculturally as well. The North had 75% of the country's farm acreage, produced 60% of its livestock, 67% of its corn, and 81% of its wheat. All in all, they held 75% of the nation's total wealth. That final statistic, combined with the North's victory in the Civil War, should be sufficient to dispel the idea that America was built upon slavery. But let's entertain that idea from a mathematical perspective. Let's say what I said was true, but slavery built America. Let's entertain that. So let's look at the math here. Mathematically, the black population, including free blacks, has averaged 12 to 15% of the U.S. population during most of our history. So please explain how this portion of the population who was involved in manual labor could be responsible for producing more than 12 to 15% of the nation's wealth. Think about this. The South only produced 15% of the country's wealth. The North produced 75%. And of that 15%, the African American population was only 12 to 15%. Explain those percentages to me. I'm always very incredulous when I hear statements like that. Just a few more observations here. The Confederacy lost the Civil War because the South's infrastructure was underdeveloped. And that's because they were more focused on producing cotton. They neglected all the rest of their infrastructure. The dependence on harvesting raw materials, primarily cotton, but also rice, tobacco, and sugar, caused the South to neglect its infrastructure. While the South stagnated into plantation culture, the North industrialized, building factories to process these raw materials, and the infrastructure to transport it, roads, railroads, seaports, etc. When the Confederacy went to war with the Union, they not only lacked the infrastructure to produce and transport war materials, but also depended upon the Union as its biggest trading partner. And they had difficulties supplying their overseas trade partners because they lacked adequate seaports. And foreign trade partners preferred finished textiles to barrels and unprocessed cotton or sugarcane. So neglecting infrastructure, neglecting processing materials, screwed the South over. That's why the North had a bigger industrial base and was able to bring in more revenue during the war. This also happened during the Roman Empire. You had slaves who would perform menial manual labor jobs in the fields. And that ended up causing these huge plantations to be owned by these wealthy individuals. And the common farmer could not afford to compete with slave labor while also paying wages to his workers. So slavery historically has made the economy worse. And that's why Abraham Lincoln was opposed to it, because he felt like it made the economy worse, not from a principled point of view. So this is the end of part one. In part two, we will further dissect this and decipher this.